As Texas continues to grow, a lot of that growth is depending on groundwater. And with that, there's an increasing focus on how to stretch our resources further to make our use of groundwater more sustainable to last for the long term. We're excited to have our first panel here to provide some perspectives on that topic. The panel is going to be moderated by Vanessa Puig-Williams, the Texas Water Program Director at the Environmental Defense Fund. I'm going to turn the floor over to Vanessa to introduce her panel. In the meantime, I would ask you all to give this panel a warm round of applause. Welcome them to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon. It's really great to see everybody. I think, Leah, this is the biggest conference that TAG has ever had, so that's pretty incredible, and I think is a testament to how important groundwater is to the state and to everybody here. And I'm excited to see everyone. I know a lot of people, but I know there's a lot of new people that I look forward to meeting over the next couple of days. As Leah said, my name is Vanessa, and I run the water program here in Texas for Environmental Defense Fund. And with me on stage today, we have Robert Mace, who's the Executive Director at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment. Deb Trejo, who's a partner with Kemp law firm. Wade Oliver, who is the, I gotta make sure I say this right, Texas Water Resources Lead with INTERA. And Mitchell Sodek, the General Manager with the Central Texas Groundwater Conservation District. So we are very excited to kick off this conference today with a discussion on groundwater sustainability. I said the S word, sustainability. I'm say it again, sustainability. I don't know if you say it 3 times, am I gonna like turn into something? But it's actually the first time that TAG has ever had a discussion about groundwater sustainability. So we're kind of in new territory, a new frontier here. And I'm not really sure why, but as I was kind of thinking about it before this talk, I mean, I just have always felt that it has been kind of taboo to talk about it. And I showed up, you know, as a water hugger. It's kind of like a tree hugger, but who loves water. And I kept saying sustainability, and everyone was like, "You need to stop saying that word." And I was like, why? What's wrong with that word? Don't we want groundwater sustainability? Isn't that a good thing? And it is. I think most people would agree, but it's also really challenging because you can't just like decide to manage groundwater sustainably one day and then have it be so. There's real challenges to managing groundwater sustainably. But I do feel like the tide is changing, that something is shifting. It's probably because Texas is rapidly growing and groundwater districts and their communities are under immense pressure, and you're feeling that. And it's just raining a lot less, so that's making things a lot worse. And so I think now's the time to have this conversation. I'm really glad we're doing it. We're gonna talk about what sustainability means, what it looks like, some of the challenges, and then how it can be done. So I'm gonna kick it off to Robert Mace to get started. I think you have some slides, right, Robert? Okay. Robert's going to talk about what we mean when we say sustainability or sustainable groundwater management.
So when I first started at the Water Development Board back in 1999, my boss at the time, Bill Mulligan, sat me down and he said, there are 2 words that you never say in public. The first one is metering, and the second one was sustainability. But we have come a long ways because we actively talk about metering, and there is active metering up in the high plains, and sustainability is more of a part of the discussion that we're having going forward. This morning when I opened up, for the youngsters out there, this is called a newspaper. I opened up the newspaper in the Austin American-Statesman, and this was on the front page: less groundwater, more demand, about kind of the ongoing issues in Williamson County with people's wells, basically water level falling below their pump, or in this case, this fellow says his well went completely dry out the bottom and needs a new well. And so sustainability is wrapped up in discussions like this, particularly in a state that's growing, where we have continuing and ongoing and growing demands. And then the question becomes, is kind of relates to desired future conditions, is what do we want our future to look like? This is a neat graphic from the 1968 State Water Plan that shows the plans to bring water from the Mississippi River to Texas. And when I did that study at the Meadows Center's webpage on groundwater sustainability in Texas, I wanted to understand kind of the history, had we talked about it. And I was surprised to learn that there's been a long-term, multi-decadal discussion of groundwater sustainability. It's wrapped up in a concept called safe yield, which is equivalent to sustainable yield and sustainability. And interestingly enough, a big driver for this project was to bring the aquifers in Texas that were not being managed on a safe yield basis into a safe yield sustainable basis. That is stated in the 68 water plan. Subsequent water plans up through the 2002 state water plan talked about safe yield. Again, that's equivalent to sustainability. And when the technocrats at the Water Development Board made calculations on how much water was available for the water planning process, the assumption was a sustainable safe yield approach, with the exception of the aquifers that were not being managed sustainably, which was widely acknowledged that there really wasn't a solution there unless you brought in the Mississippi River. And I would argue we're still at that place today. So definitions, you'll hear people say, we don't know what sustainability is. I'm going to say I know what it is. And this is my favorite definition, and I've looked at dozens of definitions. This is from the U.S. Geological Survey, Bill Alley. Groundwater sustainability is the development and use of groundwater in a manner that can be maintained for an indefinite time without causing unacceptable environmental, economic, or social consequences. So this is policy informed by science. It's very similar to a desired future condition. In fact, groundwater sustainability could be one choice for a desired future condition, and then there's a bunch of policy decisions that have to be made. How many wells do you want to go dry? How much do you want to lower spring flow? Which springs do you want to keep flowing? Which ones do you not want to keep flowing? The economic impacts. There has to be a deciding body that determines that. And I think that's where the angst with, what's the definition of groundwater sustainability? This is the definition, but it requires a stakeholder process or some deciding body to determine that this is what we want and this is what's acceptable and not acceptable. One dramatic example is the Edwards Aquifer Authority, San Antonio segment of the Edwards Aquifer, where federal law on endangered species requires protection of the endangered species. That's a policy decision that's made by Congress. Ultimately has resulted in the sustainable management of the Edwards. Sustainable yield is the amount that can be produced to achieve groundwater sustainability. So sustainable yield is just like the modeled available groundwater. It's the output from the policy decision on groundwater sustainability. And so that's science defined by policy. And then there's sustainable production, and this is probably where Vanessa and I get crosswise, but sustainable production is an amount you can pump indefinitely. And it can be at any range of economic, social, or environmental consequences. And sustainable yield is a special case. Putting all these concepts on an arrow, the groundwater availability arrow, starting from 0 to infinity on the right, at some point you cross a threshold of you're pumping sustainably, now you're not pumping sustainably. It's more complicated than that, but we'll leave it right there. So we call that the maximum sustainable production. which is the highest possible sustainable yield, regardless of the environmental, economic, or social consequences. We scientists and engineers kind of like that because it doesn't have the ickiness of human interaction. There's no stakeholder processes. We can calculate that because that should be something that we can get out of the models or out of our calculations. So anything from 0 up to that maximum sustainable production value is the range of possible sustainable yields, and somewhere in there would be a sustainable yield if that's something that you choose. This is a graph from the report showing kind of outcomes of the estimates that I was able to get my hands on. And there was some work that the board did in the first round of desired future conditions that a lot of this information comes from. In some cases, there's newer models. You could certainly argue with assumptions that were made, but this is the best we got at this point. And when we look at, well, first let me draw your attention to the red line. That is where production is equal to the maximum sustainable production. So anything above that red line is unsustainable. Any bar below that line is sustainable production. I'll first draw your attention to the orange bars, and then we'll go all the way to the left. That's current groundwater production divided by that maximum sustainable production. So if it's equal, if you're currently pumping what's equal to the maximum sustainable production, it equals 1. And the blue one is the modeled available groundwater divided by that maximum sustainable production. So looking at the bars on the far left, that shows all the aquifers of Texas, both for the modeled available groundwater and for the current groundwater production, exceed sustainable amounts. We all know what a wonderful aquifer the Ogallala aquifer is in terms of being immense, high productivity. If we take it out, you can see that second set of bars with all aquifers except the Ogallala. Currently, it appears that we're pumping sustainably. Again, everything added together. There's going to be places where it's not and places where it is. And then if we look at the modeled available groundwater production in 2070 in that blue bar, we're planning right now, or we have made available right now, almost twice as much water as would be required for sustainable development. And then you can choose your favorite aquifer as you go through. I do want to say that I'm doing a lot of research on groundwater sustainability these days. It's a fascinating topic. I'm not advocating that people manage sustainably because that's not my role. I have respect for the groundwater district boards that make these decisions and the groundwater districts that make these decisions on how to manage. If I advocate for anything, it's that I feel like this perhaps should be part of the discussion going forward. After the advent of regional water planning, groundwater sustainability just fell off the table. Safe yield discussions fell off the table. I don't think that was a purposeful act. It's just when the decisions got handed off from the Water Development Board to the regional water planning groups, that part of making those decisions did not convey. So my opinion is you probably should consider sustainability, maybe look at it. The other thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is nearly sustainable production. So, the definition of sustainability is you can do it forever. But if you can pump X amount of water and you can pump that amount for 5,000 years into the future, is that close enough? Right? The average marriage in the United States, right? Marriages are supposed to be forever, is 8.2 years long. I'm not proposing that we define a time scale of 8 years for sustainability, but that may be something that's you might want to look at. And I would encourage you to look at, with the current pumping is how long can you keep that up? And if the answer is 60 years, versus 600 years, that may prompt some discussions over what you want to look at. And then I'm going to end with noting that sustainability discussions, and we'll be talking about potential solutions, Even if districts are only nearly sustaining or nearly sustainable or not pumping sustainable, ultimately we're all about trying to get these aquifers to last as long as possible. In some cases, we might be able to have them last forever, but even the ones that we're not pumping sustainably, we want those to last as long as possible. And so sustainability discussions can fit into there. I kind of think about Amarillo and the Canadian River Municipal Water Authority, where they have Ogallala holdings that they think will last 300 to 400 years. And then also just want to note one last thing is the sustainability discussion might be helpful to districts that serve rural customers in trying to decide maybe what their desired future conditions are. Because a lot of districts don't necessarily have caps on production, and someone can come in and export that water under the district's rules, and then you get this policy question of how much do you restrict groundwater export to protect kind of local interests in water and local uses of water, and sustainability can certainly be part of that discussion. So with that, I'm going to go back to this slide and leave it up during our discussion and turn it back over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Robert. The graph that you had on, actually, I've always, whenever I see that, it's a little bit concerning, but I also see that there's an opportunity in there to kind of change course. And because you said, that there is so much of policy considerations in groundwater sustainability, there is an opportunity for districts to talk about what potential changes could be made and what that looks like within your district. So I want to ask you, Wade, because you work with districts across the state that, are managing different aquifers and have different types of groundwater users. Like, if you can just kind of give us like a little overview of what sustainable groundwater management looks like in various parts of the state.
And I know we talked about these questions beforehand, but it's interesting to me because it's hard to define exactly what sustainability would look like in different parts of the state. We work with districts that manage the Ogallala. I just finished helping with the joint planning process for GMA1, and when you look at this definition of sustainability and without causing unacceptable environmental, economic, and social consequences, you could make an argument that trying to manage sustainably could cause really difficult economic consequences for the Ogallala, for example. So the thing that I constantly think about is, we work with districts across the state, and if I may characterize many of you without your permission, it's a lot of your view of groundwater management and what groundwater sustainability means is driven by the geology and the hydrogeology of the resources that you manage. The Ogallala is this unconfined, highly productive unit that's supporting tons of irrigated agriculture across a huge portion of the High Plains and the Panhandle. That leads to an approach to groundwater management and an understanding of what it means to sustain groundwater production that's different than talking about sustainability in Central Texas with the Edwards and with a karst system that recharges very rapidly but also discharges to springs very rapidly, and the sustainability considerations for a karst system are just totally different than what it would mean at the Ogallala. And then you think of the Trinity and the Gulf Coast aquifers and the Creasy-Wilcox aquifers. These are all aquifers that are sedimentary, and they dip generally towards the coast, and big chunks of these aquifers are confined, and they have huge volumes of water. But then you have much lower production. You have subsidence concerns in closer to the coast in the Houston area, and so what fits in without causing unacceptable environmental, economic, and social consequences is just very much driven by the hydrogeology of those units. And I realize, being a hydrogeologist, that maybe I'm just seeing it through my hydrogeology colored lenses, whatever color that might be. But I think that it's important to remember that. Also, as an aside, Robert, you presented that graph before. I was at the board when we were doing, I did some of the modeling associated with those numbers.
Yeah, you helped me out.
Yeah. And that's an example to me of stretching these models, these GAMs, which are fantastic tools, to the limit of what they were designed to do. So sometimes that's pouring additional water into these models that they wouldn't exist there in reality. So I could see a scenario where those numbers could be changed.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the science in just a minute.
I'll shut up.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's good. You. I just want to give Mitchell a chance to talk about his district, which is in Central Texas, and for you to weigh in on, kind of when you look at this definition and some of these factors, how you're kind of actually thinking about them in Burnett County.
Sure, absolutely. Is this on?
I don't know. We're having a little bit of, I think, mic issues up here, but
Test.
hopefully y'all can hear us.
Okay. Is it on now? Okay. Central Texas, we're in Burnett County, and it's a high growth area adjacent to the Austin corridor, and that offers many different challenges. And being on the outcrops of the hill country, we're blessed with many springs and base flow through creeks and rivers that are our environmental factors that we want to consider for sustainability. But then we also have all this influx of growth and economic growth in business and in people that need support as well. So it's a very fine balance with a pretty finite amount of resources. And I think scale is very important when we're talking about sustainability. Robert, you laid out a great graphic of aquifer-wide global scale, but really the management comes down at the local level, at the district level, and that's where all the nuts and bolts of what groundwater districts can do really takes hold, and we can really define what we want those environmental conditions to be in the future, what we want the economic growth to look like. And one of the examples that we've been doing in our district is looking at management zones to protect some environmental spring flow. Krause Springs is a very popular spring in Burnett County. It's out of the Trinity Aquifer. It's not a tremendous amount of water that comes out of it, but it's very valuable for the local area. And it's something that our board said, hey, we want to try to protect this. How can we do that? And we started with science. We've hired some consultants with USGS and some folks with the Meadows Center to define what we're even looking at. What causes the spring to flow? It's in an area that's otherwise a drought for groundwater. You can drill dry holes everywhere, but in this area you've got some springs flowing out. So why is that? What's the extent of it? In order that we can protect it, what is the spring shed boundaries so that we can then create a management zone that we can have separate rules for, and those rules can be designed for maximizing spacing between wells, minimizing the production, and ultimately with the goal in mind to provide for those springs to continue to flow, and definitely it be the hope with the end goal. And we're at the very early stages of this project. We have not implemented a management zone yet, but we're trying to model this after another project that I know, Vanessa, you were involved in as well with the Jacobs Well in Hays County, and they've done the science so that they can then provide a management zone which provides specific rules for that area with specific yields that are available, and in hopes that the Jacobs Well and the spring flow, even though it may be dry at the moment, is not dry too many days out of the year moving forward.
Yeah, so y'all actually have defined I guess, diminished spring flow in some ways as an unacceptable environmental consequence for your district.
Yes.
So that's okay. I mean, Mitchell had mentioned, this comparison between like looking overall at an aquifer sustainability versus local. I didn't know if you wanted to kind of add in to anything there.
Sure. And this, I'm not sure which one works. Test. There we go. That maybe this one. Yeah, it depends on the hydrogeology. Kind of going back to what Wade was saying, and then also what Mitchell was saying about spring shed. So karst systems, these limestone aquifers with springs tend to respond really well or be good candidates for management zones where you can define a spring shed and for the most part, adequately regulate the production zone to manage spring flow if that's what you want to do. And there's a number of examples of that. Hayes Trinity has kind of really went through a wonderful exercise working with stakeholders and their permittees to seek to manage Jacob's Well in a more sustainable way. Middle Pecos Groundwater Conservation District does groundwater management zones for its areas, but you also have to remember also that these management zones are small parts of a bigger aquifer, and so you still have to worry a bit about what's going on outside a management zone that could impact what's happening inside the management zone and what your goals are. Probably not such a big issue with the Leon Belding Management Zone for Middle Pecos. Could be an issue going forward for the Jacob's Well Management Zone. Just as examples of things which you have to watch out for. And then you look at Barton Springs or San Marcos and Comal Springs. Those spring sheds are much bigger than a management zone. So you could argue that it's appropriate that it includes the entire aquifer in that case to try and achieve those management goals.
Okay. Well, so I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the tools that districts need to be able to manage groundwater sustainably, what kind of legal authority they have to do that, and we'll get into some of the science. But Deb, you've been quiet, so I want to make sure you get a chance to talk because you're our designated attorney on this panel. And so if you could just kind of share your thoughts on under Chapter 36, what authorities groundwater districts have to manage sustainably. I think we often hear about the Edwards Aquifer Authority, but, groundwater districts are not the EAA. So, what is it that they can do within their current regulatory authority?
I know, I was just waiting. So there's a lot. Chapter 36 really does not specify what districts can do to the full extent of what they can do. So broadly speaking, the number one thing that you do to manage sustainably, and I want to make this point that, we didn't say that unacceptable in the definition is subjective, right? But it obviously is. What is unacceptable is really largely going to depend on who's sitting on the board of directors of a groundwater district, right? What they determine as a policy matter is acceptable or not acceptable, and then sort of what their public will sustain and allow them to stay in that role and continue to do, right? And so that might change depending on who sits on a board, what is determined to be acceptable and what is determined not to be. Because as we've discussed, aquifers are being managed for decline in some cases, and in other cases they're being managed for long-term sustainability. The definition says indefinite time, right? But we know that that's not practical in many cases because there's already developments, homes dependent upon groundwater sources, and the switches aren't always that easy. Even in areas that seem like they would have access. We've had trouble in the San Marcos area in certain parts of the county, but in the town of San Marcos that they can't really feasibly run lines out to provide city water service. And so then what do folks do? And there may not be a productive aquifer that you can drill into that you can get a permit to drill into. But so the first thing is cutting back production. And that first and foremost is about regulating wells and having all the wells in a county be registered within the district and with many districts, that's the first step. They're just figuring out what they have. How many wells are there and how much are they producing? Setting up a regulatory scheme that's very basic. Now, many districts here have much more advanced and longer term rules, but I do want to say that given what we know about climate change and the headlines of the paper today, the sooner that districts get rules on the books that have specifications for users, the more defensible those rules are, because they become part of the legal landscape that people plan around. If there's a groundwater district but they're not doing anything yet and they want to do something, well, you want them to do it as a business, as a homeowner, because you need to know what the regulatory landscape is. So I would encourage districts and folks in different communities to encourage regulatory schemes to be established that set forth registration requirements, metering requirements, pumping requirements. So just the very basics of groundwater production management under Chapter 36 are first and foremost. Then you can get into some nuance around things like, depending upon if, well, I think we always want conservation, right? Conservation and maintain our supply, whether that's recharge dependent or not, are key. So having conservation rules may be something that a district considers doing, and having demand management critical period rules that limit withdrawals when there's a drought condition because there's just less water to go around. So those are some things. I think there's a lot of partnerships that are possible, that there's some legal aspect to them because we may be looking at contracts and interlocal agreements, but counties, cities are already in people's mailboxes with bills, in their email boxes with alerts, and we can work as the subject matter experts on groundwater and how what the source of supply for people's use is within our communities to inform those folks about the connections and the need to conserve and what they can do. And so there's lots of other kinds of pilot programs. Get the county, encourage the county to fund things like water conservation kits, to reduce use for toilets and showers and all the ways that we use water. There's a lot of really effective groundwater conservation district conservation work with irrigators. There's a lot of opportunities there to save big amounts of water. And so I think there's a whole plethora of regulatory and policy incentives that can be put into place. And I just want to encourage folks to think about additional opportunities with the private sector. Right now, we're in a world where large corporations are trying to show their greener side. We're all feeling the pinch of climate change. There's opportunities to enter into agreements to you be the subject matter expert as an underfunded groundwater district or community that's working with your groundwater district, and have them put resources into what would really help reduce use within your county and GCD.
Okay, that's super interesting, Deborah. Mitchell, can you comment? I mean, are y'all working with different partners? I sort of feel like, Deborah, you said that there's like this sort of inside the box way of doing things with the sort of strict Chapter 36 confines, but then a little bit more outside of the box, looking at other tools and partnerships, maybe one of those. So can you comment on that?
Absolutely. I think us groundwater districts, we kind of understand where our limitations may lie. And so being a facilitator of these other entities is a great place for us to start, where we have either limited authority or limited funding. And as Deborah was saying, at my district, we've worked with the county quite extensively the past several years, where we have pushed them to adopt water availability requirements for subdividing in rural, unincorporated areas of the county. And we've also worked with cities that do the same thing if they do not provide water through their water systems. And through that effort, we've developed a relationship where the groundwater district is reviewing all those studies. We're providing our feedback. We're being a party at the table. And I think it's making a difference. The counties outside of a PGMA are pretty limited on what they can require on those studies. But I think it's making a difference, much more so than not having one, absolutely. But it's building a relationship as well. And so we've developed that relationship with the county's commissioner's court. So we've asked them to fund a project through their ARPA funding, the American Rescue Plan Act funding, that I think it was last year at this conference that I heard a presentation.
Carlos, I saw you. You present. There you are. You
Yeah,
had that presentation last year.
Carlos Rubenstein's presentation last year kind of got my mind thinking, and we approached the county to do a conceptual model with our consultant at INTERA for Burnett County alone, and it was completely funded by the County Commissioner's Court. We entered into an interlocal agreement, as Deborah was talking about, with the county, where we are provided the deliverables and we're a member providing in-kind services. And the goal is that this will help us to do local planning with this updated information so that we can do it sustainably. We can know that if these developments are going in, we've got this structure here with these parameters. Will this support this development, whether it's on a public system or private wells? And I think it will definitely benefit us. We just entered into that contract, or actually the county's got the contract, but we've just started that project. So I think that's one avenue that the districts can be a facilitator. The other is just have stakeholder meetings where you bring other parties that have interest, Environmental Defense Fund, other environmental organizations that have especially environmental flows in mind, or even economic drivers, cities and other corporations that have this idea, but being the groundwater districts, we have a goal or a vision in mind, and we can help facilitate that and kind of get to the end result, which is what we want to do, is manage sustainably. And we do have all this growth coming in with these major corporations, these super chip manufacturers, these tech companies, these rocket facilities. All these people are coming to Texas in droves in recent years. And I think there's a very good opportunity for districts to work with those people and develop some programs or incentives to further the mission of managing the resource for everybody.
That's cool. Well, I want to make sure we have time to talk about science. So Wade, I'm going to not segue very smoothly, but just shift over to science. Because as Mitchell said, it is really an important, piece of this whole equation. And it's probably the piece that you should start with, I think. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And just, whether you think the GAMs are, well, actually, you answered that, like that you don't really think the GAMs are where they should be in some cases. But what else is needed?
Yeah, I got ahead of myself over there. So the thing with the science and with the development of the GAMs is that models are developed for a purpose. And right now there's not a requirement within the joint planning process or within Chapter 36 that districts quantify what sustainability is. We've made efforts at some GMAs at quantifying something that sounds like sustainability when you think of the balancing test, for example, with joint planning, where you balance the highest practicable level of groundwater production, which is also an interesting thing to try and quantify with the conservation, preservation, and et cetera of the aquifer. But I'm not suggesting that there needs to be a requirement to quantify what is sustainable, but I do think that it's a relevant consideration. And the reason that I start with that on the science piece is that when the Water Development Board or when groundwater districts are deciding to update their models or deciding how much they want to invest in updating their models and what trade-offs with model design are being made, the modelers themselves, the funding agencies, the districts that are driving it, need to constantly have in front of their mind, how is this tool going to be used? Because if the GAMs are not designed to be an effective tool for quantifying what the sustainable level of production is, then we're not going to have it follows that we're not going to have a tool that's going to be able to do that well. The example I brought up earlier about boundary conditions in the models that allow for an unlimited flow of water into the model. That's an example of a model design decision that limits the way that it can be used, limits the questions that it can address. So if managing sustainability, or at least understanding what the sustainable level of production is a priority, then it would make sense for that to be a, not that everyone's going to agree, but widely known so that the tools can evolve to be able to answer that effectively.
So I guess the answer is that probably the GAMs as they are now in most cases wouldn't really be workable for a district that wanted to manage more sustainably.
For the most part, they weren't designed to answer that
Okay.
question, and so we do the best with what we have. I mean, in the groundwater world, we're used to scavenging tools and data, but there can certainly be improvements in that.
Yeah, and I think it depends. You know, it depends on the model, depends on the question, but a key aspect is understanding the surface water groundwater interaction, because when you're in the sustainability space, that water is coming from pirated natural discharge. And then when there's not enough natural discharge to pirate, that's when you start getting those consistent water level declines year after year. And so that surface water groundwater interaction component is real critical. And that's many of the models, it's probably one of the weakest parts. And it's one of the weakest parts because it's probably the most difficult to simulate and collect data on.
So what kind of data does a district need if they want to manage more sustainably? Do we just need more monitoring wells? Do we need more studies like about groundwater surface water interaction or subsidence? Deb?
I just have a quick one that we probably wouldn't have added, which is production numbers. A lot of districts really don't even have good production numbers because they're not metering all the wells that are non-exempt, even within a district, on top of exempt wells. Or if you've got those 36-121 districts, you know, municipalities that are exempt, that are pumping a lot of water. But even knowing your own production is the first thing, and then all the other pieces that you'll probably talk about.
Yeah, those y'all in karst aquifers have it lucky, because you tend to have defined discharge points. The recharge is more discrete, so it's easier to measure. But when you get to these sandstone systems, things get much more complicated.
There's that, but I want to echo exactly what you said. That was actually the first thought that came to mind was production. It is interesting to me that I'm telling you this as someone who develops groundwater models and has done this lots of times. The most difficult thing to get right is the pumping. And it's not the stuff that's buried thousands of feet underground that's really hard for geologists to figure out. It's the stuff that all the people on top of the ground are doing, because that's much harder to predict.
Do you want to say the M word?
No, I don't. Okay.
Wait, what's
that's
the
a different
M-word?
talk. Metering.
Oh, metering.
Metering
Oh,
was
okay.
the M word.
We're saying it now.
I was listening to your talk
Well,
earlier.
Deborah already said the C word. She said climate change. So we're just, we're being really provocative up here. But I mean, is that because of exempt well pumping not being able to be calculated, or what is the problem with being able to accurately calculate production?
It's exempt wells. It's the history of development. It's the quality of data. There's a whole lot of wells in this state that we don't even know exist, even within groundwater districts. And that's not because of people doing nefarious things. That's because wells have been going in the ground for 100 years or more, and it's hard to get data on that. Yes, groundwater surface water interaction is the other key piece that is going to be useful for defining the sustainable level of production. But Robert, I'm glad you started piracy of surface water as a topic for this.
The P word.
Yes.
Okay, so production's obviously usually important, and oftentimes that means it has to be reduced, right? So that can be done through regulations, but groundwater is privately owned, so sometimes we have to think about other ways that we can do that without infringing on property rights to a huge extent. So I want to talk a little bit about incentives and how that can play into this overall sustainability puzzle. Deborah, do you have thoughts from work that you've done with districts where, I mean, I know it's a big thing in the EAA, but maybe like some other examples too across the state?
I think one thing has to do with how pumping is metered, reported, and charged. So depends a lot on, I think that districts can use the incentive of fees as a way to reduce production. So if your district has an authorized amount and you pump on that and you're going to pay the fee regardless, you really have no incentive not to pump it. If you can get a rebate on those fees, if you can pay less based on less pumping, those are sort of simple things to look at the fee structure. A lot of districts don't have even, in some cases, the ability to assess any fees on pumping. But fees on pumping are a very simple, elegant, and helpful to the district because it gives them some money to regulate with, regulatory tool. So where districts can begin to assess fees on pumping, I think that's a very helpful thing that they can do to reduce production and creates a great incentive for production. And I just think some of the other stuff we talked about as well. I think, yes, they're looking for opportunities for conservation easements, looking at pivot installation and writing grants to USDA and others, and like the North Plains District has done a nice grant for ag reduction. The EAA did agricultural conservation loans, but of course has a huge program through the HCP, the Habitat Conservation Plan, to pay irrigators and other users not to pump when the aquifer can't really sustain it as well, but it allows them to do it when water's high. Of course, that's karst aquifer, so when it rains, there's more water available for everybody. That isn't true in every aquifer. But I think really looking at conservation and what opportunities there are to leverage private-public partnerships to have folks reduce. And an example that happened not that long ago in our region here is obtaining funding from a large corporation for water to be recharged and to protect land to recharge water into the aquifer, because we want to get as much in as we can, right? And
there's that Post Oak Savannah Groundwater Conservation District program that compensates people for not pumping their groundwater. So there's, that's another way to, compensating folks for not using the groundwater underneath their property.
Mitchell, I know you said y'all are still kind of in the early stages, but is this something that the stakeholder group that you've put together is going to be exploring, or once you've identified that spring shed?
Absolutely. I think conservation easements is the first thing that comes to mind. It's a relatively small area that we're talking about, so that seems to make the most sense. But we're looking at any possibility that, and really want to listen to the stakeholders. They are the people that are going to be impacted the most, and so we're really looking to gather ideas from them as to what they want to look like. And the other idea is possibly purchasing water rights, either having a group outright purchase those so that they're held and only exempt well use could come into play after that.
Yeah, to add to that, so the EAA has created the largest groundwater market in the EAA Act has created the largest groundwater market in the state of Texas. But a lot of what's interesting and that other districts can do but haven't really engaged in is to really look at their transfer. Now, we've got the Guitar decision out there that does provide some limits depending on what kind of permitting scheme you have, if you have historic permits. But allowing districts, if they can acquire funding, let's say through a private-public partnership, for an entity to help them acquire transferred permanent rights to bank them. So for instance, the EAA in its act specifically provides for a groundwater trust, but you don't need to have that listed in your act. It's simply a contract. And Chapter 36 authorizes districts to contract to promote and prolong their purposes. And so one of those things could be that you allow permitted users to transfer and you give them some money either for annual leases into your groundwater trust. In other words, the water just sits there and isn't pumped. I mean, it's sort of just that simple. It doesn't actually go anywhere. It's a paper transaction. But that you allow water to be transferred and held. And that could be through a conservation trust that manages that. It could be through the district itself if it obtains funding. A city or other entity could do that too. And just opportunities for folks to make a little money to do something good. And it's kind of a win-win. The other kind of related thing, but it's dangerous, because when we think about sustainability, we always want to consider, we want water to be sustained generally, whether it be surface or groundwater. But there are opportunities where cities have water and they want to sell it, and folks are on groundwater because that's just historically how they've developed. And those are some real opportunities, and we've seen that in McLennan County for to move folks off of groundwater onto surface water or some other source. I mean, it could be rainwater.
Okay, how are we doing on time? 10 minutes? Okay, so why don't we, I want to talk a little bit just for the next few minutes on some of the challenges to doing all of these really great things that we just talked about, and then take a few questions. So, I don't know, one of you guys, whoever's ready to jump in and talk about, what is the, I mean, obviously this is really important, but like what makes it so hard for districts to be able to do this?
I think competing interests is our biggest challenge. Just looking at Burnett County alone, it's much like many areas of the state where we once were raising cattle and now we're raising people. So that shift has happened seemingly overnight. And so not only is it, domestic or municipal use, now we've got all these companies coming in that are competing with that use. And in the groundwater world, we can't prioritize it. So that offers a challenge when some of our, well owners think that, well, you should be protecting my drinking water and not this industrial quarry that's next door to me. They don't need the water as much as I do, but we're not able to prioritize that. And I think that's going to be a challenge for much of the state moving forward, is balancing those competing interests and also keeping the sustainability in mind.
I was going to say time and money. Groundwater districts tend to be very underfunded and don't have the resources to sort of solve these big problems in most cases. And boards are made up of usually volunteer members who come in and serve, maybe come in once or twice a month for an hour or two. And so the bandwidth to take on these challenges isn't necessarily there in the vast majority of districts, right? Underfunded, under-resourced. But I think this is where we really need to figure out how we leverage partnerships with universities and nonprofit organizations, because those are being underutilized in many instances right now. The geologists around the state, the biologists around the state, who could provide technical expertise. And then I think districts should see themselves as subject matter experts. And I think a lot of times folks are pretty humble and don't realize, hey, I'm the expert on groundwater. The city's on surface, for instance, and they don't really understand all this. And we do, so we've got to kind of lead, I think, a little more and take on the mantle of leadership around the state. But I think that's going to require more partnerships with technical experts, because I think the part of being underfunded is you don't have a lot of resources to hire technical consultants and engineers who would help you understand the hydrology of your aquifers and the science and all the connections.
I think the lack of a cap on permitting / production is a big one. In order to manage sustainably, you have to have a cap on production.
And the DFC is not a cap.
It is a changeable cap.
It could be.
Right, it could be. I mean, I see the MAG as a cap on production, but it is something. Some districts modify that as permits come in and bump it up into something Russ would call reverse engineering. But I'm talking about districts' rules. That oftentimes there isn't a cap, and there's some legitimate issues there, like not telling folks no when they come in. But if there's no cap, then the permits just keep increasing. Particularly if you're a donut district, which you are, kind of around an urban area that's growing. all of a sudden, here comes development, here comes much bigger pumping than you've had historically. And in a traditionally rural districts, the rurals just aren't ready for the big dog to walk in and slap the permit down for a bunch of water. And then once the word's out, that's where you can go get a good meal of groundwater, then everybody comes in through the door. So I think that's a big issue. I think there's some, I'm intrigued by what the Guadalupe County Groundwater Conservation District does with a correlative rights approach with allocating their modeled available groundwater. Post Oak Savannah, if everybody exerts their private property right to get a permit and pump water from the district, they end up in a correlative rights situation. So kind of wonder if that's a potential solution going forward to that issue.
Wade, do you have a last thought before we take a question or two?
I was just gonna second Mitchell's comment about the challenge being the balance. I think everyone in this room, absent everything else, could agree that managing sustainably is a desirable goal. And the problem is making sure that people have water is also a desirable goal. And those two, it's like having your cake and eat it too. I'd like to have the cake tomorrow, but I'd like to eat it today too. So we'll, so yeah, I think that's really the challenge on my side.
Do we have any questions? Did y'all hear that? There's mics right here in each of these. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Carol Patterson, and I serve on the Edwards Aquifer Authority Board in Bexar County. And one of the things we learned in the 2011 to 2014 drought was that ASR is essentially interchangeable with pumping reductions. So that was part of the way we got through that drought with the environmental outcome that we wanted. The springs continued to flow with 4 times the population that we had in 1956 when they stopped flowing, which was an extraordinary accomplishment. But what I'd like to have you address is ASR as a possible solution, not just pumping reductions. In other words, ASR is a way of harvesting rainfall such that it's a win-win. It supports the environmental as well as the people considerations, and it supports the rivers as well, downstream rivers as well as the upstream aquifers.
Yeah, we actually did not touch on alternatives, and I think ASR is one, rainwater catchment, other managed aquifer recharge projects, maybe brackish. I don't know if y'all want to quickly weigh in, but
yeah, and then conjunctive use, ASR kind of falls under a big umbrella of conjunctive use, but ASR, that project that San Antonio Water System has worked fabulously, and it's helped spark a number of projects along the I-35 growth corridor, including Austin is planning to put in a big one. And then also looking, it's not quite ASR, but it kind of is conjunctive use. El Paso, trying to keep their groundwater, their fresh groundwater, to last as long as possible. They use the surface water when it's there, and then groundwater when it's not. And the Canadian River Municipal Water Authority does something similar with Lake Meredith, using it when it's there and using groundwater when it's not, which is another way of extending groundwater supplies. El Paso is one of those situations where it's practically sustainable. It'll probably, with conjunctive use, it'll probably last for hundreds, if not thousands of years, even if it's not technically sustainable.
Well, you have ASR and soil regeneration and low-impact development, all as a way to harvest rainfall for use so that good drainage should no longer be getting rid of the water.
yeah, that's a really good point. Leah, do we have any other? Okay. Thank you.
All right, sorry. First of all, so we have been struggling a little bit with the audio. We did, before we get into this, we did try to adjust some things, so hopefully it got a little bit better partway through that presentation. We'll kind of take a poll after to figure that out. But got one in asking, basically, how do you work with the county when maybe the district and the county aren't completely on the same page when it comes to development and growth, where the county is not in that role of being the water provider and the growth is, and that development is fueling growth in the economy locally? How do you, what might y'all suggest?
So whoever submitted that, thank you for the question. It is understandable that groundwater districts and counties might not always be on the same page about the path forward. That said, groundwater districts have access to expertise and to resources and an understanding of the groundwater situation that I think counties can make use of. And the fact of the matter is, if development comes in and there's not enough water to support that development, and 10 years down the road there's neighborhoods with big houses that no one can live in because there's no water, like that. No, the groundwater district doesn't win in that case, but the county doesn't win either. And so, yes, adding to the list of challenges here is human interactions with people, but finding common ground between these governmental entities where you can both push forward to say it is a good thing for us to have a reliable supply of water is hopefully something that everyone can agree on in that case.
Do we have another one, or did you?
There are two more that came in. I just want to make sure there were no other panelists that wanted to weigh in on that.
You're good? Okay.
All right. Okay, fantastic. So the next one is kind of a doozy. What about private property rights? How can you really manage sustainably when groundwater is privately owned?
Well, I know what Robert's going to say. Okay, go ahead. No, we could say it like in tandem.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to me, sustainability truly protects private property rights. Assuming that the person who asked the question doesn't truly believe they own everything underneath their property and can suck it all out. The reason I say sustainability arguably truly protects private property rights is whether you use it or not, it's going to be there in the future for use. Versus if you don't use it and your neighbor uses it before you do, through rule of capture, they're going to pull it out from underneath your property, and you won't have the water. So in my mind, sustainability gets there. Now, under sustainable management versus unsustainable management, you're not going to be able to pump as much.
No, I mean, I get that question a lot, actually, and that's my answer, is by managing groundwater sustainably, but you're protecting everyone's property rights across the aquifer. So
fair share. Did you see those koozies out front? 12 ounces equals your fair share from Sledge Law. I got one. It's awesome, but it's a fair share. Everybody gets a fair share.
I think that there are the technical answers. I think if the question is, how do you do it legally? Can you get away with it? Can you do it at all? Because you're going to get sued for a taking. The answer is yes, you can. You can do it. Because if you don't, you're going to get sued also. If you think about it, if you have management of groundwater, then in 10 years or 20 years, there's water for you to use, versus there's no management of groundwater, and in 10 or 20 years, there's no water for you to use. You now can't use your property, right? So as property, we need to regulate groundwater so that private property has access to water in the future, right? I mean, that's why districts are created with the consent of residents and citizens, because we need something to control it, otherwise somebody's going to suck it dry. But in terms of practically, the better argument for the private property owner is, I was doing this thing, I invested in this business, and now you stopped me altogether from using water. They have a reasonable claim against a district for regulation, right? I already invested, you changed the rules, and now you say I can't pump it all. If you don't completely prohibit pumping as a district, and you allow kind of regulation across the board in a reasonable way, then there isn't a valid takings claim against you. as a district. The other piece of that is what I'm saying about creating a regulatory scheme. The piece about contracting, like the regulated community, businesses and owners of property need to know what the rules are, but they also need to be able to conduct transactions. If I need water for my business in 10 years and there's no regulation, then I can't guarantee that I'm going to have that product in 10 years, right? So for the market to be sustainable, we need to have sustainable natural resources to underpin the market, right? For all things, for commerce, for the economy. It's important for districts to get rules on the books that set out a regulatory scheme. The statute of limitations on takings claims, regulatory takings claims, is 10 years in the state of Texas.
Yeah, and unsustainable pumping works really well in the Ogallala Aquifer. It's unconfined. Those cones of depressions are relatively small compared to a confined aquifer, although collectively they lower aquifer levels. And for the most part, everybody is pumping out there. So it's sort of a collective agreement that we're going to go ahead and drain, baby, drain. When you get into these confined artesian aquifers, you know, one big well or big well field can have a cone of depression. Like the Aggie cone of depression for Bryan College Station is 100 miles wide, is the cone of depression there. You get huge cones of depression in those systems that can have impacts on a huge array of landowners. So, you know, in general, my observation, if somebody's already pumping real big or want to pump big, they're not real keen on sustainability, but folks, you know, ranchers and folks that aren't pumping a whole lot of water, that would prefer to keep water underneath their property, tend to be more supportive of sustainability.
Wonderful. Well, that does kind of take us to the end of this panel. Let's give these panelists a round of applause. That was a great conversation.